Imagine a city official earning this massive government salary in one of the richest financial hubs in the world.
Right, like a really comfortable position.
Exactly. And they take to a podium to literally shout, "Fuck capitalism."
Which, to some people might sound like this bold, progressive statement of solidarity.
Yeah, but to the right-wing commentators we are studying today, that moment is, well, it's not a political victory. The source actually frames it as horrifying proof that Western civilization is being actively dismantled from the inside.
Right. They basically describe it as adults playing dress-up as teenage revolutionaries.
It's intense. Welcome, everyone. If you're joining us for the first time or, if you're a long-time listener, we are thrilled to have you here for another deep dive.
Absolutely.
My goal, as always, is to take a stack of highly specific, sometimes incredibly dense source material and unpack it for you. We take the noise and we look for the signal.
And today, the material we're diving into is, well, an intensely charged piece of political commentary.
Yeah, we're analyzing a transcript from a YouTube video published by the Dutch newspaper De Telegraaf. And this specific conversation focuses really heavily on the future of right-wing politics in the Netherlands.
Right, and it gets into the collapse of institutional trust and this looming sense of, geopolitical doom. And we should probably clarify up front that De Telegraaf is historically a populist, conservative broadsheet in the Netherlands.
Good point. The commentators featured in this video are definitely not mincing words.
No, not at all. This transcript is basically a window into a very specific, deeply alarmed worldview. And they connect, local municipal grievances directly to global warfare.
But before we go a single step further, I really want to establish some extremely clear ground rules for you, the listener.
Yeah, this is crucial.
The source material we're examining today features highly opinionated, right-wing, anti-immigration, and culturally conservative viewpoints. Our mission today is not to take a side.
Exactly. We aren't here to validate these arguments, and we aren't here to condemn or debunk them either.
Right. We are acting entirely as neutral guides. Think of us as sociologists examining a cultural artifact.
Yeah, our job is solely to deconstruct the ideological landscape, right? To unpack the rhetorical devices and explain the underlying cultural anxieties that these commentators are expressing.
So whenever we say the commentators argue, or, the source claims, we are simply reporting the perspective presented in the text. We want you to understand the intellectual architecture of how these commentators see the world.
Well, regardless of whether you personally agree with that vision or not.
Exactly. And let me just tease the massive conceptual journey we have ahead of us today. We are going to see how a narrative jumps seamlessly from a Dutch politician buying a loaf of bread at a bakery.
Which is a wild starting point.
It really is. Jumping from that to the threat of geopolitical upheaval in Iran, all the way to the dystopian warnings of George Orwell's 1984.
And I think the overarching theme tying all those disparate elements together is this profound, almost existential frustration with current political leadership.
Yeah, so to understand the worldview presented here, the source suggests we have to start at the ballot box.
Right. The text opens with this really fascinating dissection of the modern conservative voter. They specifically focus on the concept of being politically homeless.
Let's explore that. The transcript begins with one of the commentators explaining his recent vote in the local municipal elections.
And he voted for the VVD, right?
Yeah, which is traditionally the mainstream liberal conservative party in the Netherlands, party of former Prime Minister Mark Rutte. But he explicitly states he is a deeply reluctant voter.
He actually dislikes them.
He does. He criticizes them for campaigning on this tough right-wing rhetoric and, promising stricter immigration and lower taxes, but then inevitably forming coalitions where they govern with what he sees as left-wing European liberal policies.
Well, and the structural context here is crucial for the listener to understand. The Netherlands operates on a system of extreme proportional representation.
Right. There are usually over a dozen parties in parliament.
Exactly, which means no one ever wins an outright majority. Coalitions are literally mandatory. So the commentator's frustration stems directly from the mechanics of this system.
Through his lens, the establishment right has basically spent the last decade watering down its core principles just to maintain power in centrist coalitions.
Yeah, he feels totally betrayed by the very party that is supposed to represent his economic and cultural interests.
But then you have to ask, why vote for them at all? Why not vote for a party further to the right?
And he addresses that directly in the text. He actively avoids the populist right-wing party, the Forum for Democracy, or FVD.
Right. He notes that based on his recent highly negative experiences with the FVD electorate, he just simply refuses to associate himself with them.
Which really illustrates a massive wedge in European right-wing politics right now because, the FVD started as this intellectual conservative movement.
But over the years, and especially during the pandemic, the source notes they embraced much more volatile, conspiratorial populism.
Yeah. So for a traditional conservative voter like someone who just wants lower taxes, strict law and order, and serious governance, the FVD has become completely radioactive.
So this voter is basically trapped. He holds his nose and votes VVD purely because, in his specific municipality, they are the least bad conservative option available.
He wants serious, pragmatic leadership, but he feels the political market is only offering him either globalist liberals or volatile populists.
And this deep yearning for quote-unquote serious governance naturally transitions into this blistering, highly personalized critique of how modern politicians behave in public.
Oh yeah, they zero in on Rob Jetton here.
Right. Rob Jetton is a prominent progressive politician and the leader of the D66 party. And the source accuses Jetton of basically embodying everything wrong with the modern political persona.
They argue that he focuses almost entirely on identity politics and public relations rather than actual tangible policy.
The commentators claim he's desperately trying to score what they call a premier's bonus.
Which is essentially a vanity bump in the polls, right?
Exactly. And they say he does this by loudly and unnecessarily centering his sexual orientation in his political messaging.
To build this argument, the text highlights a couple of really specific anecdotes. First, they mock this viral meme involving Rob Jetton at a local bakery.
Oh, the bakery story. The commentators describe this highly performative scenario where Jetton is allegedly trying to demonstrate he's just, a normal man of the people buying bread.
But he somehow feels the need to announce his identity to the baker.
Right. And the punchline of the meme, at least as the source tells it, is the baker looking at him blankly and basically saying, okay, but what kind of bread do you want?
And the rhetorical strategy of including that meme is so telling. The commentators use it to frame identity politics not as a civil rights issue, but as an expression of sheer narcissism.
Yeah, in their view, the general public, which is represented by this pragmatic working-class baker, is just entirely indifferent to a politician's personal life. The baker just wants to do his job.
Exactly. The text argues that constantly broadcasting one's identity is an imposition on a society that has, in their eyes, already moved past caring.
And then they escalate this critique of superficiality. They bring up an Instagram post where Jetton shared a photo of his partner.
Right, and the partner was wearing a suit officially sponsored by the brand Suit Supply.
Yes. For the commentators, that Suit Supply sponsorship is like the smoking gun of elite frivolity.
Because the text paints a picture of a world standing on the precipice of these historic, monumental crises. I mean, they explicitly mention a looming global energy crisis, inflation, warfare.
And in the face of these tectonic global shifts, they see a man who aspires to lead the nation posting sponsored fashion content on social media, like he's a lifestyle influencer.
If we think about how the source frames this, it's a terrifying disconnect for them.
It really is. It would be like being stuck in an emergency room with a severed artery, and the lead surgeon walks in, ignores the bleeding, and starts filming a TikTok about their new scrubs.
Wow, yeah. That analogy really captures the panic the commentators feel. It isn't just about the policies. It's about the perceived absolute lack of situational awareness from the people at the top.
Right. They define serious governance as this ruthless focus on national security and economics.
Yeah.
So to them, the fashion posts are a dangerous distraction.
Furthermore, the commentators actually compared this modern iteration of the public persona to older generations of famous gay Dutch figures.
Yeah. They specifically name-drop entertainers like Wim Zonneveld and Albert Mol.
And through the conservative lens of the source, these men were beloved because their identity was incidental to their talent. They didn't flaunt it or use it as a political cudgel.
So the text is making a deeply conservative argument for assimilation over exhibitionism. But I have to pause here and look at the blind spot in their argument, though.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, does the source engage with the idea that visibility actually serves a political purpose for marginalized groups? Like, for a young gay kid in a highly religious conservative village, seeing a national leader openly and proudly embrace their identity might be a total lifeline.
That's a fair point. It proves they can participate at the highest levels of society.
Right. Does the text acknowledge that representation is a form of political action, or do they just blanket dismiss it as vanity?
They absolutely blanket dismiss it, but they do so by arguing that the sociological landscape makes that visibility actively harmful to progressive
Oh,
goals.
so.
Well, they argue that the Netherlands is fundamentally a tolerant country already. So treating sexual orientation as a brave political stance is fighting a war that was won decades ago. But more importantly, the source points out this massive, unacknowledged contradiction within the left-wing platform itself.
Okay, lay that out for me.
The commentators explicitly claim that Jetton's hyper-focus on his sexuality actively alienates the very minority groups the progressive left is simultaneously trying to court.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, they point out that parading LGBTQ visibility plays incredibly poorly with Orthodox Christian communities and, crucially, with conservative Islamic communities.
So the source views the left as trying to build an impossible coalition. Like, you cannot be the party of imported conservative religious minorities while simultaneously being the party of radical gender and sexual progressivism.
Exactly. They believe eventually those two worldviews will violently collide.
So if you're a voter who believes the government is basically wasting its time on bakery photo ops, sponsored suits, and impossible coalition building, that annoyance naturally metastasizes into genuine fear when actual physical crises hit.
Right, because if the captain is busy posting on Instagram, who is steering the ship when violence breaks out?
Exactly. And that is exactly how the commentators pivot from mocking political personas to sounding a massive alarm on local crime, the asylum system, and the breakdown of systemic trust.
And the shift in tone here is really stark. The text moves away from the halls of Parliament in The Hague and focuses on a horrific local news report from RTV Utrecht.
Yeah, the commentators dissect a criminal case involving a Syrian asylum seeker who allegedly assaulted two Syrian women.
And the logistics of the crime, at least as presented in the source, are staggering. The assaults took place across two entirely different asylum centers.
Right, one in the wealthy town of Wassenaar and another in Marsen. But the mechanism of the crime is what the commentators really latch on to. This wasn't just like a random act of violence. It was calculated extortion.
Yeah. According to the source, the perpetrator specifically targeted women from highly conservative Orthodox Islamic families.
And he manipulated photos of these women to make them appear either without their hijabs or completely naked.
Yes. He then threatened to send these manipulated, shameful images back to their conservative families unless they complied with his demands.
And his ultimate demand, according to the text, was to force one of these women into marriage.
Right. Because as an undocumented migrant, marrying someone with status would secure him a permanent residence permit in the Netherlands.
Which is incredibly dark. And the commentators don't just view this as a tragic police blotter item. They use this specific, horrifying anecdote as an absolute indictment of the entire Dutch state apparatus.
Precisely. They look at the logistics of the situation and see a complete collapse of state control. The central agency responsible for asylum seekers in the Netherlands is the COA.
And the source expresses sheer disbelief that an unvetted individual, someone who hasn't even been granted the right to stay in the country, is apparently allowed to travel freely and unsupervised between different government facilities miles apart.
They even mention the visual of asylum seekers riding around on expensive electric fat bikes.
Oh, right. It's a very specific image. Like if you were a working-class Dutch citizen struggling to pay your energy bill and you see an undocumented migrant zooming between towns on a 2,000 euro e-bike to commit extortion.
Yeah, the commentators are definitely channeling the intense societal rage that visual creates. They view it as a state literally subsidizing its own anarchy.
But I think the deepest sociological insight the text offers in this segment is about the cultural clash.
You mean regarding the honor system?
Exactly. The commentators highlight how the perpetrator weaponized the women's conservative Islamic honor system against them. He used the threat of bringing shame to the family, which is a concept with potentially lethal consequences in their home culture, to extort them while they were living in a liberal Western democracy.
Because the Dutch legal system fundamentally doesn't know how to compute that threat.
Right. That is exactly the point the text is making. The Dutch legal system is built on Western individualism. It assumes the victim and the perpetrator are independent actors.
It is entirely unequipped to handle honor-based violence, where the victim's own family might be the ultimate threat if a manipulated photo is released.
So the commentators argue that by bringing in large numbers of unvetted individuals from the Middle East, the West isn't just importing human beings.
No, the source claims they are importing the geopolitical conflicts, the tribal rivalries, and the conservative honor systems of the Middle East. And the progressive Western state is rendered totally impotent against it.
The text explicitly states that the country has brought in an enormous problem with Syrian migrants, claiming a significant portion of the youth misbehave dramatically.
They view this imported chaos as a massive systemic failure. And they immediately connect this failure of immigration policy to the most pressing economic issue in the country, the housing crisis.
Which is huge right now.
Uh,
The Netherlands is currently facing a catastrophic shortage of affordable housing.
yeah. And the commentators bring up a left-wing politician, Paul Tang, who argues for what seems like a pragmatic, straightforward solution. Tang says the government just needs to build more houses.
Right, Tang's perspective is that this is simply a construction and zoning issue.
But the commentators reject that premise entirely. To them, saying build more houses is like trying to bail out a sinking boat with a teacup while refusing to plug the massive hole in the hull.
Through the right-wing lens of the source, the housing crisis is not a construction failure. It is purely a demographic failure driven by immigration.
Exactly. They argue that even though the state is building roughly 70,000 houses a year, it will never be enough because the government is actively importing insane numbers of people.
It's a mathematically ruthless way of viewing the world. The text argues that if there were no asylum migration and no massive influx of labor migration, the native population would be stable or even shrinking.
Therefore, there would be zero housing crisis.
Right. It's a purely zero-sum worldview for them. Every single apartment given to a status holder is an apartment physically taken away from a native Dutch citizen who's been on a waiting list for, like, 10 years.
And that physical displacement, the anxiety of being literally squeezed out of your own country's housing market mirrors a much deeper, more profound anxiety that the commentators spend the next portion of the text exploring.
Oh, yeah. They believe the native population isn't just losing physical space, they are losing cultural space.
This brings us to a fascinating concept I want to call cultural inversion.
I like that term, because the commentators don't just feel neglected by the state, they feel like the fundamental rules of society are being aggressively rewritten to penalize native traditions while simultaneously subsidizing and celebrating foreign ones.
Yeah, this feeling of inverted reality is really the cornerstone of modern right-wing populism, and the source illustrates it with a very stark contrast. Let's look at the first half of their equation. The treatment of native Dutch traditions. They bring up Podsverin, or Easter fires.
Right. For listeners who might not know, in the rural eastern parts of the Netherlands regions like Twente and the Achterhoek building, these massive towering bonfires for Easter is a deeply cherished, centuries-old communal tradition.
It's a huge moment of local pride and social cohesion.
But according to the commentators, the government is actively banning or severely restricting these local traditions.
And the mechanism the government is using to ban them is crucial to understand the anger here. The fires are being shut down due to incredibly strict environmental regulations regarding nitrogen emissions.
Known in the Netherlands as the stikstof crisis. We have to explain this briefly because it's not just about, saving the trees.
No, it's a bureaucratic hammer that effectively paralyzed the entire country.
Because the Netherlands exceeded European Union limits on nitrogen deposits in nature reserves, the government was forced by the courts to halt massive amounts of construction, lower the national speed limit, and aggressively target the agricultural sector.
Yeah, even threatening to forcibly buy out and shut down thousands of multi-generational family farms.
So when the commentators mention the ban on Easter fires, they are tapping into a massive well of profound rural resentment.
The native working class views the nitrogen rules as this invisible, suffocating weapon wielded by urban elites.
From their perspective, a bureaucrat in a pristine office in The Hague is telling a farmer in the Achterhoek that he can't light a bonfire his grandfather built because a spreadsheet says it emits too much nitrogen.
Exactly. It feels like a targeted cultural erasure disguised as environmentalism.
Now hold that feeling of bureaucratic suffocation in your mind and look at the second half of the commentator's equation. While the native citizens are being told they can't have a bonfire, the commentators point to massive state-sanctioned celebrations of Islamic traditions.
Yeah, they specifically cite London's mayor, Sadiq Khan, shutting down Trafalgar Square, which is obviously one of the most iconic public spaces in the West, to host a massive public Ramadan iftar meal.
And the text does not view this as a beautiful mosaic of multicultural harmony, do they?
Oh, not at all. They frame it explicitly as a pure provocation.
Let me offer an analogy to explain the emotional mechanics of how the source views this hypocrisy.
Go for it.
It's like living in a strict, overbearing homeowners association. You, the native resident, get fined by the HOA board if you leave your trash can out for an extra hour or if your grass is half an inch too high.
Right. Highly regulated.
But then, the HOA board invites a group of non-residents to come camp on the neighborhood golf course. And not only do they waive all the rules for them, but the board actually pays for their tents and throws them a welcome parade.
Wow. Yeah, the outrage isn't just about the tents. It's about the weaponization of the rules against the native residents. The commentators feel like second-class citizens in their own civilization.
And the source firmly believes that the mainstream media is actively complicit in engineering this cultural inversion.
Yeah, they launch a really harsh critique of how religious faith is covered by the press, specifically targeting the AD newspaper, which is a major Dutch daily.
The commentators accuse the AD of essentially fetishizing stories about native Dutch youth converting to Islam.
They claim the media landscape is just saturated with these conversion narratives, constantly framing Islam as a source of, connection, discipline, and inner peace.
The press, according to the source, portrays the choice to adopt Islam as this bold, progressive step toward a more meaningful life.
But the commentators point out a glaring double standard, they ask. What about the native youth converting to Orthodox Christianity?
Right. The source notes that in an increasingly chaotic world, many young people are actually seeking structure by returning to ancient, rigid forms of Christianity. They even mention groups like the Arameans in Enschede.
But the media, the commentators argue, completely ignores these Christian conversions, or, if they do cover them, the editorial tone shifts entirely.
Yeah, when a young person chooses traditional Christianity, the media frames it as a regressive, backward slide into patriarchal oppression.
So through the lens of the source, the media is not objectively reporting on religious trends. They are making an active ideological choice to portray the West's historical foundational religion as an embarrassment, while simultaneously framing a foreign religion as enlightened.
Which begs a massive question about the commentator's endgame. Like, are they simply asking for a secular public square where all religions are ignored equally? Or are they arguing for the explicit cultural and historical supremacy of the Judeo-Christian tradition in Europe?
The text heavily implies the latter. They do not want a neutral, sterile society. They want a society that unapologetically defends and reflects native Western history.
And this feeling of a media and institutional double standard reaches an absolute boiling point when the source discusses how the state handles the concept of discrimination.
Yeah, this is where they bring up Mona Kaiser, a prominent conservative politician, and her outrage regarding a government official named Rabin Baldusing.
Right. Baldusing holds the title of National Coordinator Against Discrimination and Racism.
And the timing of the events the text highlights is critical here. In a week where there were literal physical attacks on Jewish institutions in the Netherlands.
Yeah, the source notes a synagogue and a Jewish school were targeted.
Exactly. Baldusing chose that exact moment to publicly announce and prioritize a new government program specifically addressing Islamophobia.
To the commentators and to Mona Kaiser, this is a breathtaking display of ideological blindness. They use this incident to argue that the institutional left has created a rigid hierarchy of victimhood.
And in this hierarchy, Muslims are perceived as the ultimate marginalized group that must be protected at all costs.
The source argues that the state apparatus is so obsessed with maintaining this specific narrative of victimhood that they will literally ignore real-world violence against the Jewish community.
To the commentators, the National Coordinator Against Discrimination isn't actually fighting discrimination. He is acting as an ideological enforcer for left-wing identity politics, manipulating the public focus away from inconvenient truths.
And this sense of cultural betrayal doesn't just exist in a vacuum. It translates directly into how people vote and where they live. The feeling that the rule makers despise the rule takers creates a massive geographic polarization.
Right. The people enforcing these progressive norms tend to live in very specific urban centers, completely detached from the rural areas dealing with the fallout.
The commentators delve into the results of recent local elections to map this divide, and the geographic split they observe is stunning.
While left-wing parties, specifically the Green Left Labor Alliance, lost significant ground nationally, They absolutely dominated the major cities.
Yeah, Amsterdam is held up as the prime example of this urban left-wing hegemony.
And the disdain the commentators have for Amsterdam is so palpable. They don't view it as the cultural capital of the country. They describe it as an infantile asylum.
Wow. Through their lens, Amsterdam is a parallel universe. It's a bubble of extreme privilege that has completely severed itself from the economic and cultural realities of the rest of the Netherlands.
The commentators even joke about building a literal wall, like a cordon sanitaire, around the city limits, so the rest of the country doesn't have to suffer the consequences of Amsterdam's voting habits.
To crystallize why they view the urban elite as infantile, the text highlights a highly specific, provocative quote from an Amsterdam city official.
Yeah, they point to Zita Pels, an alderman for the Green Left Party.
This is the quote we started the show with. The commentators highlight a moment where Zita Pels publicly chanted, "Fuck Donald Trump, free Palestine, fuck ICE, fuck capitalism."
And the commentators just deconstruct the sheer historical and economic irony of that statement.
Because she's a high-ranking government official, right?
Exactly. Earning a massive salary, roughly 10,000 euros a month, paid for by taxpayer money generated by a capitalist economy.
Furthermore, she is shouting "fuck capitalism" in Amsterdam, which is historically recognized as one of the birthplaces of the modern stock exchange and global corporate trade during the era of the Dutch East India Company.
So to the commentators, this proves that the urban political class lacks any serious intellectual rigor.
They view Zita Pels not as a serious leader dealing with complex urban issues, but as a wealthy aristocrat. Essentially, LRPing as a Marxist revolutionary.
Right. She gets to shout edgy slogans and enjoy the moral superiority of radical politics, while safely ensconced in the luxury and security provided by the very capitalist system she is condemning.
It's the ultimate symptom of a society with too much time and money on its hands.
The source forcefully contrasts this perceived urban decadence in Amsterdam with what they view as a massive pragmatic success story in a different city, The Hague.
Yes, the commentators spend a significant portion of the text praising a populist politician named Richard de Mos, who leads a local party called Hart voor Den Haag.
And what makes their praise of Richard de Mos so fascinating is the demographic reality of his political coalition.
Tell me about it. De Mos is decidedly on the right, correct? He's a former member of Geert Wilders' Nationalist Party.
He is. Yet, according to the source, he won a massive electoral victory in The Hague by building an incredibly diverse, immigrant-heavy list of candidates.
Wait, let's unpack that. Why are these right-wing commentators, who just spent half the transcript warning about the dangers of immigration, suddenly praising a diverse, immigrant-led political movement?
Because of the mechanism of integration that de Mos represents. The text argues that de Mos proves that true societal integration is never achieved through left-wing identity politics, diversity quotas, or state-funded sensitivity training.
Okay, so how is it achieved in their eyes?
According to the source, integration is achieved through shared economic ambition. The commentators highlight that the immigrants on de Mos's list are entrepreneurial.
Pragmatic localism. It's the ultimate conservative integration fantasy. The commentators believe that de Mos's message is essentially, I do not care where your grandfather was born, and I don't care what religion you practice, if you speak the language, if you start a business, if you pay your taxes, and if you have a heart for this city, you are one of us.
Exactly. They view this as a return to ombudsman politics. Fixing potholes, supporting local businesses, and ensuring the streets are clean.
The text argues that if you drop the identity grievances and focus purely on capitalism and local pride, ethnic divides naturally dissolve into a shared middle-class ambition.
Yeah, they hold up Richard de Mos as the pragmatic, working-class antidote to the wealthy infantilism of Zita Pels.
But the source immediately pivots back to Amsterdam to argue that when a city lacks that pragmatic law and order foundation, the result isn't a progressive utopia. It's terrifying, violent lawlessness.
They illustrate this with a deeply disturbing anecdote about a local JA21 politician named Kevin Kruger. JA21 is a conservative party.
And according to the text, Kruger was violently assaulted on the streets of Amsterdam. The context is vital here. The source claims he intervened when he saw a group of youths, whom they specifically identify as North African, harassing a woman on the street.
Right. The commentators describe how Kruger was beaten and kicked by this group, but the physical assault isn't actually the part that enrages the commentators the most.
It's the bureaucratic nightmare that unfolded immediately after the violence. The perpetrators apparently stole Kruger's phone during the beating.
And when city-funded street coaches arrived on the scene to mediate the situation, the youths actually had the audacity to issue demands.
They told the street coaches they would only return the stolen phone if Kruger agreed to delete any video footage he had filmed of them harassing the woman.
The text seizes on the presence and function of these street coaches. This represents a crucial element of the commentator's worldview: the privatization, or rather the therapeutic outsourcing of justice.
Right. In a functioning, serious society, the commentators argue, if a group of youths beats a politician and steals his property, the police arrive and use the state's monopoly on violence to arrest them immediately.
There's no negotiation.
None.
Yeah.
But what the source sees in Amsterdam is a state that has basically surrendered its authority.
The fact that criminals feel comfortable enough to negotiate the terms of their own crimes with unarmed, city-funded social workers proves to the commentators that these youths have zero fear of consequences and zero impulse control.
The text argues that a government too busy shouting, "Fuck capitalism," and obsessing over identity politics is fundamentally incapable of enforcing basic law and order on its own streets. They have created a vacuum of authority, and the violent youth have filled it.
And this is where the deep dive takes its most massive, breathtaking leap. Because the commentators don't view this collapse of street-level authority as an isolated, local problem.
No, they take this feeling of urban chaos, this belief that the West has gone soft and lost its survival instinct, and they project it onto the entire global geopolitical stage.
This is the terrifying climax of the worldview presented in the text. They view the weakness they see in the streets of Amsterdam as a fatal existential vulnerability in the face of genuine militarized global threats.
The source dramatically zooms out from the Netherlands and focuses on the Middle East. They discuss a highly specific, looming global energy crisis.
Yeah, the commentators cite a geopolitical scenario where Iran, acting as a hostile state actor, decides to bomb the massive oil and liquid natural gas terminals in Qatar.
And the economic math they do here is brutal. They warn you, the listener, that such an attack would instantly disrupt the global energy supply chain, leading to petrol prices skyrocketing to €3 a liter or more.
This wouldn't just be an inconvenience. The text implies it would trigger an immediate, devastating economic collapse across Europe. It would freeze supply chains and wipe out the purchasing power of the middle class overnight.
They are sketching a worst-case scenario where the comfortable, privileged illusions of Western urban life are violently shattered by cold, hard geopolitical reality.
And against this backdrop of potential global warfare, they evaluate the intellectual rigor of the people supposedly in charge. They speculate on the internal stability of the Iranian regime.
And they introduce a fascinating, highly specific detail here. The source mentions that a prominent columnist for The Telegraph, Afshin Elian, who is himself an Iranian-born legal scholar, is actively advising Reza Pahlavi.
Right, the son of the former Shah of Iran. The text views Pahlavi as a potential transitional figure if the current theocratic regime collapses.
Why do the commentators include this detail? Like, what's the rhetorical purpose?
To contrast the scale of the stakes, they are trying to show the listener that serious, world-altering history is happening right now. Geopolitical maneuvering is required. Intellectuals should be preparing for tectonic shifts in global power.
But when the commentators look back at the intellectual centers of the West, specifically the universities, they don't see serious preparation. They see institutions crumbling from a rot within.
The text brings up an interview with Jessica Reitman, a professor of Jewish studies at the Vrije Universiteit, or the VU, in Amsterdam.
According to the source, Reitman publicly described feeling politically radioactive on her own campus in the aftermath of the October 7th attacks.
And the commentators use her profound alienation to launch a scorched-earth attack on university leadership across the entire country.
They don't just speak in generalities either. They specifically name-drop high-ranking university administrators, such as Rianne Lechert at Maastricht University and Alexander van Huffelen, who is transitioning to a role at Radboud University in Nijmegen.
The source blasts these administrators for their handling of campus protests. Through the commentator's lens, university leadership has allowed aggressive, masked, anti-Zionist protesters to run rampant, occupy buildings, and destroy property without facing expulsion or legal consequences.
The commentators argue that by failing to protect Jewish staff and by attempting to dialogue with masked students who are breaking the law, the universities have completely abandoned their duty to uphold intellectual integrity and safety.
Yeah, they don't view these protests as expressions of free speech. They view them as a hostile, ideological takeover of Western institutions by anti-Western actors.
Which brings us to the grand unifying thesis of the entire source text. After touring municipal elections, asylum centers, urban crime, and geopolitical warfare, the The commentators pose what they call a final litmus test for any political figure, intellectual, or citizen.
And the test is startlingly simple and aggressively binary. Are you pro-Western or are you anti-Western?
The commentators acknowledge, briefly, that the West has a dark and complex history. They mention the legacy of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade.
But they argue that when you tally the historical ledger, the Western democratic system is the only structural system in the history of human civilization that has consistently allowed for true individual freedom, freedom of speech, and the emancipation of the individual from the collective.
It's the ultimate trump card in their argument. They point out that this unique systemic freedom is the exact, literal reason why millions of migrants from the Middle East and the Global South risk their lives to come to the West in the first place.
They're fleeing systems that lack the very freedoms the West provides.
Exactly. And because of this unique historical achievement, the text argues that Western civilization must be unapologetically aggressively defended, cannot be negotiated away by guilty academics or infantilized city councils.
And who in their mind is the enemy in this civilizational war?
The source identifies a dual threat. They believe the West is being squeezed between radical, unassimilated Islam, pushing from the outside, and self-loathing anti-Western leftists eroding the foundations from the inside.
So if we look at the intellectual architecture the commentators have built, the local street violence where a politician is mugged in Amsterdam, the university protests shutting down classes in Maastricht, and the geopolitical instability in the Strait of Hormuz.
To the commentators, these are not separate, isolated news stories. They are all interconnected fronts in a single existential war for the survival of Western civilization.
The absolute core of their frustration, the reason they sound so incredibly angry and alarmed throughout the text, is the belief that Western intellectuals are actively dismantling the only machine that protects them.
Right. When Zita Pell shouts, "Fuck capitalism," or when university administrators refuse to clear out masked protesters, the commentators view them as tearing down the very societal load-bearing walls that guarantee their right to exist, to speak freely, and to protest in the first place.
They are cutting off the branch they are sitting on. It's a powerful, deeply pessimistic, and highly cohesive view of the modern establishment.
Let's pull all of this together as we wrap up this deep dive. The source material we've unpacked today paints a vivid, terrifying picture of a society that the commentators genuinely believe is experiencing a total inversion of reality.
We started with a politician staging a photo op at a bakery, which they view as the original sin of frivolous leadership.
And we traced how that lack of seriousness allowed the asylum system to lose control, how it led to a cultural double standard where native traditions are penalized, and how the state ultimately outsourced street justice to social workers.
All of it leading to a desperate plea to defend the intellectual and physical borders of Western civilization.
And to truly understand how deeply they believe they are losing this fight, we must look at the specific literary recommendations the commentators make at the very end of the source text. It is no coincidence.
Right. They look directly at their audience and explicitly instruct them to read George Orwell's 1984 and Aldous Huxley's Brave New World.
They do not recommend these books as abstract political theory. They recommend them as survival guides.
The commentators genuinely feel they are currently living in a dystopia where reality is being gaslit and where language is actively manipulated by the state and an obliging media.
Yeah, when a national coordinator against discrimination decides to prioritize fighting Islamophobia during a week where Jewish schools are facing anti-Semitic attacks, the commentators do not see a policy disagreement. They see pure Orwellian doublespeak.
They believe the state is trying to force citizens to ignore the dangerous reality they are observing with their own eyes.
It is a worldview defined by a profound, agonizing sense of alarm and an absolute total loss of trust in every major institution, from the media to the universities to the police to the parliament. And as we finish up here, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over.
We have just spent the last hour meticulously mapping out a highly specific, deeply alarmed, and logically self-contained political universe.
In an age where our media algorithms and social feeds are so incredibly fragmented, what actually happens to a nation when different factions of the exact same country completely disagree on the basic nature of reality?
The progressives look at Rob Jetton and see a victory for representation. The commentators look at him and see the fall of Rome.
The left looks at climate regulations as saving the planet. The right looks at them as the intentional erasure of rural culture. When one side thinks they are playing a standard game of political tennis, and the other side believes they are in a literal existential trench war for the survival of civilization. How does the democracy function?
How do you pass a budget or build a bridge when the citizens are living in entirely different dimensions?
Thank you for coming on this deep dive with us. Keep exploring, keep analyzing the mechanisms behind the arguments, and above all, keep questioning the information around you. We'll catch you next time.